Good morning, everybody joining us this morning. We are really happy to have you once again here with us in this second series of seminars measuring gender-based violence in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are really excited to have you here with us in the second day of activities, and I'm sure that these will be of great interest for all the participants. Before we start, I just want to make some housekeeping announcements. First of all, I wanted to remind you that we have interpretation. Just select in the bottom of your screen the button of interpretation, and then you can select between English or Spanish. I would suggest you do it right now because we do have several presentations, and some of them will be done in English and others in Spanish. Secondly, I would like to remind you that everybody who is with us during the 3 days will receive a participation certificate or diploma. And lastly, even though throughout the webinar we're going to continue repeating this, the presentation and the recordings of these presentations will be available at the UNODC website afterwards. So don't worry, you don't have to take notes very quickly or take images from the screen. You're going to be able to have all the presentation, and those who are enrolled in this webinar will receive these. Now, before we begin, and before I pass the floor to our panel members, I'd like to remember what we talked about yesterday, because I believe that that was quite good to have these different perspectives and to have this good introduction to this topic from international and regional experts that talked about the different elements and aspects of gender-based violence. As you know, all of these webinars are part of one of the development goals, and the UNODC is actually working a very important component to this with this development account. But this has a main goal, which is to strengthen the national statistical systems. Gabriel Gomez talked about that, about the statistics division, the UN Statistics Division. We also were fortunate to have the participation of the coordinator for the Center of Women's Statistics in UN Women, who allowed us to tell us what are the conceptual elements that we face to be able to measure gender-based violence and what are we really facing in this topic. We then had the great fortune to have Alejandra Valdez from the Gender Equity Observatory of the ICLAC, and she talked about all the efforts that they are doing in that organization to try to measure gender-based violence and violence against women, and also to talk about the different aspects and capacities that the states in the region have to carry out that work. She also talked about, in these last years, what have been the main changes or the main milestones to measure this phenomena. We then had the opportunity to learn about a very important initiative developed by the Population Fund of the United Nations, presented by Jose Calderon, who talked about an initiative that is behind this Population Fund and that is being designed globally, but that will also have a huge emphasis in the Latin America and in the Caribbean region, where you can take online courses to improve the way or the capabilities to see, understand, and use all the information that comes from different surveys to measure women violence. And lastly, we had the privilege to listen to Alejandra Rios from INEGI, from the Statistical Office in Mexico, who talked about this comprehensive system for information on violence against women. This is a huge effort to include different information sources in just one database that would be useful for the decision-making process and that is related with elements and aspects that are directly related to with women's violence, but also with other aspects that can help us to contextualize this phenomena in Mexico's reality. Today, we're also going to have a series of very important guests. And so as to not take up much more time, I would like to start with the first presentation. I'm really happy to say that during this first presentation of the day, we're going to have Andrea Llerena, who is the regional advisor for data in Latin America and the Caribbean. And she will talk about the use of surveys that help us to collect data on gender-based violence, obviously regarding women specifically. And we have 15 minutes for your presentation, Andrea. And please, I would ask you to just be true to that timeline. And when we are 5 minutes before the end of your participation, I will just briefly remind you that you only have 5 minutes left. So thank you very much for your participation, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Roberto, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. As Roberto said, in the next 15 minutes, we are going to talk specifically about these issues that we want to analyze, which is gender-based violence. And we also want to identify and see what is really happening with all the surveys that we have. Just 1 second. We want the screen to, the presentation to be there. So just 1 second, please. Great. So I want to thank the UNODC for just making us be part of this space that's so important to be able to analyze what is happening in the region. And I'm going to start very briefly with a more general panorama, and then we're going to go specifically into the surveys. The first question is, what is the data that we're using to identify the reality of violence against women? We specifically know that they use surveys and official sources that the statistical office in the different countries are using. But here I want to mention two main differences. First, the specific surveys of violence, of gender-based violence, and additionally, we have the initiatives in the countries about the use, the violence modules in other national surveys, like reproductive violence and other surveys that have to do with specific areas that cover all of these issues and include other information. It's also important to talk about all the progress that's been made to be able to understand this problem of violence against women regarding all the administrative records. And even though we've made progress in the different countries that work in information systems and interinstitutional coordination offices, I also want to highlight the work of the IPAC and the Observatory of Gender Equity to this regard. And we have certain guidelines that we've also been working on. I want to talk about the statistical framework to measure homicide of women and girls due to gender reasons. This is a framework document to get worked by the UNODC and the UN Women. And they talk specifically about these issues. And in the Caribbean, they also working on this protocol for the processing of administrative data in domestic violence. So we can see that not only the countries are generating these efforts, but us as organizations are also providing these guidelines or documents that would allow you to implement or that could help us look for the comparisons there. And I also want to talk about other sources of information that are currently really important and that allow us to understand these realities. It's really important to understand that there might be some different type of limitations or focuses or approaches, but we can talk about these quick surveys that help us to identify these issues in other areas, especially with big data. There was a study that was done against political violence against women, and so that it could be measured there, as well as we have this quick gender violence surveys based on UN Women. So here we're going to go directly to these surveys and the violence surveys and see what is happening here in the region. And some of the data that I want to share with you is to understand what is happening with feminicides based on the information that we have here for 2020 and 2021, what has been happening with the death of the partner that comes by the hand of the other partner, and also those that have suffered physical or sexual violence from their own partner in the last 12 months. Now, something I want us to identify here is that even though we might have the information from the different countries, this information not necessarily is comparable because the metrics, the methodology, or the ways in which we are measuring are kind of following or limit the way in which we can analyze the phenomena. This specifically happens with the violence surveys and the way that we are measuring this violence. Now I'm going to go into a general panorama of what has been happening in these last years regarding the surveys that are specifically done to measure gender-based violence. We can identify here that 9 countries have had these initiatives, and actually there are 2 more countries, Guatemala and Colombia, which added and which will be doing these first surveys between 2023 and 2024 that have to do with gender-based violence. And I also want to say that since 2020, when we had the pandemic also, we were able to identify that 4 additional countries started analyzing with these surveys the violence phenomena. These are Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and as I said, we're going to add Colombia and Guatemala to this. So with this first slide, we want you to see that we have a lot of information within the countries, which is really helping us to understand what is happening with gender-based violence. Additionally, it's important to say that in order to carry out all of this survey work, there are guidelines to be able to proceed and to talk about some of the recommendations and to analyze how each of the countries can work on their surveys in addition to their internal decisions. So we have the analysis, the guidelines for the production of statistics on violence against women. This is from the United Nations. We also have an analysis of violence against women. That is a comparative analysis of 12 countries and from the PAHO. And there we have good recommendations that we could analyze. And we also have a methodological manual to see how to use these gender-based surveys. So with this framework and understanding that several countries have implemented these surveys, we are now going to see what is happening, how each country has been really using these analysis, especially the one of that are focused on violence in each one of their countries. So for this, I'm going to present a very brief comparison analysis between these surveys, considering 6 main variables that I believe were pertinent, like the age of the women, the territory approach, the analysis, the time of the analysis, the way they're doing the survey, the modules present for the types of violence, so that we can identify the differences that I was talking about when each country implements their own surveys. Now, we're going to analyze each one of them, and I'll start with the age of the women. Within the UN document, we recommend, or the document recommends that specifically women who live at home and that are 15 years of age or older be included regardless of their marriage situation or their relationship status. It's important to see that from all the countries that we've analyzed, 6 countries include women 15 years of age or older. But there are other countries that, considering what they want to tackle or what is the context that they have in each of their countries, we see that there are interesting differences. In Peru, for example, they cover women from 12 to 49 years of age. In Belize, they have women from 15 to 49 years of age. And then we have others that go all the way to 64 or 65 years of age, like Argentina between 18 and 65, and Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica between 15 and 64 years of age. Now, it's important to mention that in the case of Brazil, we don't have older age cap. It's only women from 16 years of age and over, and they are being used, all of them are being used to identify this phenomena. Now, talking about the territory approach, here I'm not going to go into the technical aspect, but it's important to say that when we're designing the surveys, when we want to do the sampling, we really want to understand what is the territory representation that we want to have. So it's really important that even though this will also be based on the use that we want those surveys to have afterwards and the information that we're going to use after, there are some similarities and some differences. They basically consider all the national territorial, the domestic territory. They want to understand this throughout throughout the whole territory, but there are some differences in their own territory. Some want to see what's happening with violence at the urban and rural areas. And it's interesting to say that there are some countries that have even been considering not only this national urban and rural approach, but they've also gone more in detail. For example, in Ecuador, they're doing an analysis in the different provinces based on their areas and how they have their urban planning. This has to do with how we're going to answer the different data. We have departments, regional and district areas also analyzed in different countries. So this would allow you to develop all the recommendations for public policy by understanding these differences in all the countries. And now I want to go to another variable that's very important, the time of the analysis. The recommendation presented by the UN says that we have to have two approaches, 12 months before the survey or throughout their life. So we can see that most of the countries include these two areas, but in this case, Bolivia includes another one that says throughout your relationship. So we can analyze not only these two approaches regarding the time frame for this, but also throughout the relationship. What are the methodologies that we are currently using? Well, it's important to mention that there are methods that are really traditional, like physical surveys that can be used. Others are using digital devices, computers, tablets, smartphones that will allow you to have certain matrices, validation matrices already included and allow you to recollect information easier. There are some cases where people, without even having to answer directly to the question, could select an answer. And so that could also help us. So we see that 8 countries use this digital surveying methods, and they could implement the surveys like that. And we're going to close with the modules. We can identify that in modules, this could focus on the characteristics of the home or the household, also to understand what are the social demographic characteristics of the women that we are analyzing, if it's done in the social environment, in the educational environment, the work environment, in the familiar or the couples environment. We also saw that in the countries, there are some differences with the types of violence and the environments that have been analyzed, but we see that in general, the information structures are quite similar. But here they can also identify certain differences. For example, in Bolivia, there is a specific section on roles, and they talk about women 60 years and older. In Uruguay, they talk about violence in infancy and the knowledge of the law. That also helps us to create the necessary context. In Mexico and in Ecuador, we're also analyzing the roles, the women and men role, the conflicts between the couples, and what is happening in this situation. Chile also includes a section on sexual crimes. Belize talks about access to communication media, ITCs, and others. We can also see that they talk about health issues, reproductive health, which allow us to create this specific context. And I want to close specifically with the different types of violence and the environments. We see that specifically we include physical, sexual, psychological, and or financial violence are the ones that are mainly analyzed in both environments, in the public and the private environments. But we could also identify that in Uruguay, they include media violence, violence in the process of interrupting the pregnancy, violence in the infancy, or violence to older women. In Mexico, They have obedient violence in Ecuador. Also, we have in Chile violence against elderly women. In Belize, violence of domestic violence and family violence, or specifically any attempt of feminicide or symbolic violence that was included by El Salvador. So basically, we can identify that there are methodological differences in the region, but there has been progress made in each country. Each country builds their own surveys to answer or to help us identify their own reality based on a certain territory with a specific approach in each one of the situations that we want to have. And the most important thing that I want to highlight here is that we need data to be able to identify these realities, but we not only have to stay there, we have to develop the necessary spaces for analysis, debate, and reflection to guide public policy actions based on all of these efforts that are being done to have these statistics. We also need to remember that these are interinstitutional processes. We have to have the dialogue with the users and with the producers to cover it. And we need to have this South-South collaboration where we can identify these best practices or these lessons learned on the challenges that each one of the countries face. And lastly, we need to know that we need laws, policies, prevention, and repair. Thank you very much. Roberto, I pass the floor back to you. Thank you, Andrea. I really think that this comparative analysis is fascinating, what you did. And I am really happy to see the progress made in the region and the different perspectives that we have in the region. I think that it has been quite enriching, especially for all the work that UN Women has done and to be able to share what you have done. I'm sure that there's a lot of questions in the chat, but I wanted to remind you that we have a Q&A section specifically for that. I would invite all of you to include your questions for any panel members right there. Some of them can be answered directly there in the Q&A session, and others we can take afterwards. Now we're going to go to our next participant, and it's a pleasure and an honor to have the participation of Mariana Neves. Mariana is part of the UN Program for Development, and she's a specialist in governance statistics. And she's going to talk about an interagency initiative that's going to be very interesting for all the participants. Mariana, you have the floor. And just remember that we want to be as prompt.
So much. Apologies, I'll speak in English. So I'll just give 1 second for switch to English. As Roberto said, there is a translation. So thank you so much for the possibility of being here with you. And I see enormous, almost 400 participants online. And I must say I was amazed and very marveled with the presentation just before me. It's really, really interesting, the research that you've been doing. So for us, we are UNDP, PNUD. And we work on the measurement specific on the SDGs. So in this case, SDG 16. Our base is that SDG 16 is an enabler of all the other SDGs. We don't work at the thematic or all the thematic, like for instance, our wonderful colleagues from UNODC-INEGI, but specifically on indicators. So we try to monitor our progress, not in a specific country, but globally. And what we've seen so far is that for most, in our entire world, we've seen either our indicators are deteriorating or they're stagnating. It's very few cases that we actually have progress. When you speak of how we are performing, sorry, I've jumped by mistake. And this is, as you can see on your screen, is mostly just 3 indicators because there's 2 reasons. One of them is that we all actually don't have a lot of information. The presentation just before me will say no, because as you can see for Latin America, we have a lot, really a lot have been done on the victimization part, on the gender-based violence. Again, thanks to all the several entities working on it and investing on the survey, but this is not the same for all indicators, and this is also not the truth for all regions. And what it was seen is that us, as Roberto was saying, this is an interagency initiative, as UNODC and OSHR then decided that we needed more information on all the indicators. We need to support member states on all the indicators, also because the indicators are very much interconnected between them. So yes, we can see them in isolation, but it is also important to see the entire progress on the SDGs. So what you see here on your screen is everything that you see a small dot are indicators that are either supported by UNODC or OSHR, as in some cases as UNODC or OECD, which is case of 1633 on access to dispute resolution mechanism. So we, doing this assessment, we saw that there's a need on administrative records, but there's even a deeper need on having these short modules that countries that want to track their progress on SDG 16, they can implement by integrating in their ongoing survey. There's several solutions, and I'll speak of it in a bit. So this is where then the partnership focuses on. And we went through the two-year process, developing this survey, learning from, I saw in the chat several countries that I'm sure we also learned from you, and the expertise of several actors, other agencies, because we are not the first trying to measure these phenomena. So these two very intense years end up with this model, 6 models, a survey that was welcomed by the United Nations Statistical Commission, and it's made available for all member states, all actors. It is mainly for national statistical system, but it also can be used outside the national statistical system. So this survey is basically 6 models. We have on access to dispute resolution mechanism, on the corruption, discrimination, governance, on violence, which is where you are mostly focusing today, and yesterday and tomorrow, and human trafficking. So I'll speak on violence, but just before I go on violence, since your thematic is gender-based violence, there's a lot of interesting information and useful information you can also extract from other sources. One, for instance, we have on governance satisfaction public service that might affect respondents who have experienced violence differently. So the way that respondents who experience violence answer to satisfaction or health, for instance, might be different for someone who has not experienced violence. So there's important, the discrimination, well, there might be a link there, there might be not, we don't know at this stage. But on violence specifically, this is an area that UNODC, our colleagues from UNODC, has been invested greatly throughout the years. There's manual of victimizations, there's the ICCS, the International Classification of Crime for Statistical Purpose, which I'm sure that it has already been, either I've already spoke of it or you'll speak of it on the day ahead. So there is this massive knowledge that it has already been produced. You have the LACSI survey. There's a lot of actually. So the SDG 16 survey, what brings a little bit new is on psychological violence, and there's a little bit more information. So I must clarify that the SDG 16 survey does not measure gender-based violence. So the survey was designed to measure the indicators under SDG 16. And so although it does not measure, there are certain elements. For instance, economic violence is not covered at all. But despite this, there's certain elements when we try to compute two of the two of the indicators on the survey, we end up having a lot of information that's pertinent to gender-based violence. So one indicator is 1613. This is a UNODC as a custodian. Another indicator is physical or sexual harassment. And between them, we have a lot of information that ends up giving some information on intimate partner violence. Before I go over what we actually measuring here, I want to share a little bit our experience on implementing the survey and on piloting the survey. So one of the things that is very special on this domain, it was related to the preparation for the survey, the preparation to actually conduct the survey. One side of it is on, we have seen a difference with the, and this is you have international recommendations on that, when the person doing the interview is a female interviewer, or is a male interviewer. But this is not always the case. In some countries, the difference is very clear, where the respondent, regardless of being female or male, they respond very well to both sex, to interviewers from both sex. But some, we had one Arab state, it had to be females. So this is a context that when you're designing the survey, this information, it is important that we see what are the practice, what are the recommendations, hear the civil society that are working directly with the phenomenon. So even though it is the national statistical system, they have much more sensitivity to what's actually happening on the ground, and it can help us improve and see these small changes. There are certain recommendations also related to the age of the interviewers, because the enumerators, again, related differently. This is important because when we're asking these questions, you need to build the relationship with your respondent. I cannot come and start a survey and ask on your experience on sexual violence. This might not be the best approach. So there's a whole framing that it is necessary. Another very important adaptation, when I say adaptations of the adaptation to these indicators in comparison to the rest of the survey, is what was on the risk assessment on doing the operation. So we have to be aware of two phenomenon or two important risks. One is the risk to the person who is responding, who is contributing with their time and with their experience to the survey. There's a risk of provoking certain distress, so we have to be careful how we frame. If the person has been a victim, we are asking for the victimization, so we have to be sensitive to how we ask and how we address. The other is the risk for the enumerator itself, the person who is actually doing the interview, because the person is someone working for us, it has passed through this process, but it can be a victim himself or herself. So this is another care that we need to have when preparing.
5 minutes, please, Mariana.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Another was, unlike the rest of the survey that I've shown you before, for this particular part, especially on the sexual violence part, we do not recommend to use the telephone survey. We use mainly because you can see the situation, you can create mechanisms to safeguard. And also you can create more easily the trusting relationship. Another factor is that the main aggressor usually, or statistically, might be inside the household. So you have to want to be careful when you make these questions in a setting that might be, and being an aggressive setting to the person who is responding to you. So these are considerations. So what exactly, I will not read, so don't get scared. I will not read everything that I have there, but what I wanted to say is that what actually we are asking now for people to respond, we don't make a general question and were you a victim of violence, a victim of psychological violence, or a victim of sexual violence. So this is decomposed in several behaviors, also because the person who has been victimized might not see that occurrence as a victimization. So we need to go step by step, question by question, and try to gather several elements. UNODC has the ICCS, where they give you a definition of what is physical violence, what is psychological violence, although the ICCS gives a very broad term. What is sexual violence? And with that, for physical, we're going to see the threatening to hurt, the cutting, the stabbing, the throwing object, grabbing the person. For psychological, it is a lot of related to the harm or the threatening to harm, restricting the freedom in the sense of not allowing to go out, for instance, controlling the controlling behavior to the partner. On sexual violence, the forced intercourse, so in attempt of forced intercourse, the blackmailing or stripping or inappropriate touching, these are all measured there. So when doing the question, we ask one by one. On sexual harassment, ICCS does not differentiate between non-sexual harassment and sexual harassment. So the SEG makes this distinction, but the ICCS only contemplates harassment as one chapeau that includes both. And here, for the survey, we take into account two types because of the indicator. The non-sexual harassment, which is the messaging, the emailing, the posting offensive information about the person, like photos or threatening. So these all are the non-sexual, but also there is sexual harassment, some online, the unwanted message, unwanted email, the posting very private and very private footage of us. Exposure or sexual proposition, unwanted sexual. So all of these are also measured. So from these, again, I'll say we don't measure gender-based violence, but these two indicators of the UNODC, so they should share a lot of elements that might give some information. Usually the target is 18 plus because of other models, but if you're measuring this, UNODC will be a better place to give more guidance on how to perform. Some surveys accept proxy indicators, proxy interviewers. This survey does not accept proxy interview, which means one person responding on behalf of the other. For instance, on the labor first survey, sometimes we can accept a proxy, not in this case. And for the implementation, this is our models to be incorporated on other surveys. So this is the third option. This one you need the indicator, you need the information indicator to track your progress, track your investment. In some cases, in countries that do not have a lot of information on the SDG 16, they might want to take most of the models that we have on the survey. This is a country by country case, and this is we'll have to also go through. If you have already measured all the information to produce 1613 and to produce the sexual harassment, maybe you can implement the survey, but you don't need, or probably you don't need to do it again on this. So you go and you opt for the other model. So this is how the survey. Yes. So this is how the survey conducts. And if there's any information, please feel free to contact either UNODC, OSHR, or UNDP. Will be very happy to provide more information after and now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Apologies for the interruptions. Muchísimas gracias. De verdad creo que fue bastante interesante. Rescato mucho los aspectos metodológicos.
Really interesting, and I do talk about this methodological aspects that you were mentioning that are really important because it helps us to do these specialized surveys, and especially to talk about these specialized surveys or specific surveys, and something that we've been observing for some time now, and we believe is a huge example, a great example to share with all the participants. I would like to introduce our next panel member. it's a pleasure to introduce Natalia Reyes, responsible for the Gender Information System of InMujeres, the development system in Uruguay. She's going to talk about the national surveys on the prevalence of violence, gender-based violence and generation-based violence. And that's going to be very important because it's a survey that they already do. So Natalia, remember you only have 15 minutes, and thank you very much. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for this invitation. This is the second time that we can participate in these type of webinars that have been organized by the UNODC Center of Excellence and the INEGI, and we are amazed always because of their excellence and the way they do things. And so I'm glad to be here again. So now I'm going to share my presentation. Hopefully you can see this clearly. Yes. So thank you very much. And I was lucky enough to participate what Andrea and Mariana have been saying. And I think that this goes hand in hand with the work that we're carrying out and doing in Uruguay. Just to talk a little bit about the objective of this type of surveys is that Alejandra Valencia was talking about breaking the statistical silo, and for us, it's important not only to break this statistical silence and to be able to measure these occult figures that we have, but to see the prevalence of this violence. I mean, just as our colleague Martijn Kind was saying yesterday, are not measuring the formal accusations or the real cases, but they really are hiding the phenomena women go through in our everyday life, or those women who, because of different reasons, cannot receive any other type of response when we talk about gender-based violence. So there's no way for them to talk it. So that's why we carry out these surveys regularly, so that we can have like a thermometer or an idea on how this phenomena has unfortunately been progressing in our country. That's why we took the international recommendation of doing the surveys possible every 5 years. The first one was done in 2013, the second one in 2019, and we included there new ways of seeing the gender-based violence. And we have our next survey to be carried out by mid-2024. And there, we're also going to include all the work that we've already done in 2019, but also the measurement of violence to population groups, specific population groups like migrants, women with disabilities. We did some sort of observatory, but we want to extend that. And also we want to include gender diversity there in the new survey. So there we can really have more in-depth information about this phenomena. The general objectives of this type of surveys, as you all know, is to measure the magnitude, characteristics, and the tracking done to gender-based violence that women face in Uruguay, and also to compare their evolution versus the previous surveys, the previous measurements. What these surveys allow us to have is to create information on the incidence, the seriousness of violent behavior, especially in the couples relationships, but also in the different type of violence that we're going to see. It also allows us to size and see what the changes have been, the size of the changes regarding gender based violence, and see the differences in the different editions of the survey to quantify the different types of violence. The report's going to be here on the chat, and you can see the different types of violence that we measure and how we try to use these statistical information to see what are the different phenomena that have been occurring and the different manifestations of the gender-based violence. I even have some examples that I can show you. We also want to classify the different types of violence that have been considered in our national law. This is the 19,580, which is the violence against women, obstetric or OBGYN violence, including voluntary interruption of a pregnancy and the violence against women through social media. And we also wanted to create information, specific information that would help us with other type of studies that I'm going to present here, and to create some sort of social demographic profile of the aggressors and the victims also, the attackers and the victims. These surveys allow us to have a baseline and to understand the magnitude of this phenomena when we talk about violence against women, girls, and teenagers. And it allows us to analyze it and see the different ways that these violence have taken. It allows us to measure this occult, this hidden figure that is not present in any of the administrative filters or in any other registry that we might have nationwide. And it also contributes to the interinstitutional work that is very committed and systematic. So all of these surveys have a huge amount of information to be able to analyze this phenomena more in depth and more specifically, with further detail. Specifically talking about violence, and that's what we've been done in the observatory, which is also led by the Uruguay Women Organization. Now, based on the 2019 survey, the sample was of women over 15 years of age who live in their private homes in any part of the national territory. The sample design is randomized and stratified in 6 different stages of selection, and the size of the sample was 3,771 cases. Maybe you know that the Uruguay population is very large, and so we assumed 112 cases of women that have a pension, that receive money for a disability through the social bank. So we added these 112 cases of these women to the survey. I want to also say something that we don't have here, but taking the recommendation that Mariana was making, we said that the interviewers that applied this survey were 2 women. They had to have awareness on gender topics and on gender-based violence topics. So they had to have these 2 certifications. And we also trained them following some protocols of actions if they faced a specific situation. We always wanted to create this climate of trust with the persons that they are interviewing and reach certain agreements, to do these interviews, but they were also trained if they were faced with a specific situation that could not be controlled there. And they also had like a very small guideline. It wasn't like a full manual guideline, it was just a very discrete card that had their information on gender-based violence. And within that small card or very small notebook, there was also information regarding the different ways a person could receive assistance in the case of gender-based violence. So if the person who was providing the time and giving the information required this assistance, they could be able to provide that, because throughout that interview, they could realize that they were really attacked. So this could be sent to those centers, and this was based between the National Statistics Institute. Now, regarding the methodology, we use women between 15 years of age and older, and we divided in different age groups: 15 to 18, 19 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 64, and then 65 and older. The educational level was from different levels. We have the racial and ethnic background. We also analyzed disabilities, and this was done through administrative filters. We did some pre-exploratory filters to see the disability, or if a person had a disability or not, regarding the territory, the scope. We applied it in Montevideo, the metro area, and in cities with over 5,000 inhabitants, and also in cities with under 5,000 inhabitants and rural areas. We tried to identify the immigration status, if they were original from Uruguay or if they were coming from other countries, and when they started living in Uruguay. We wanted gender identity, sexual orientation, and the income level of the home also. And just to give you an overview of the different environments that we had and the types of violence. We had the social environment, educational, the labor environment, the family environment, that we divided this in the current family and in the couple or the former couple. We also included this, and that's why it has another color, because we just wanted to include it. We have the health environment, as I said, the voluntary interruption of pregnancy process, or if there was some sort of obstetric violence. And we added here a generational approach to measure the violence, both that women had suffered in their childhood, as well as the violence that women over 65 years of age suffer. We divided this in sexual violence, psychological violence, physical violence, financial violence, and we included digital violence in this survey. And this was really important because this also gave place to, in addition to the study that Andrea was mentioning of UN Women to measure violence in politicians and women politicians, we also added here digital violence. That's really important. You only have 5 minutes left. Okay, great. So just to add this, by 2019, 8 out of 10 women suffered some sort of violence situation, gender-based violence situation in their lives. This represents approximately 1,100,000 women. We have to remember the population in Uruguay is around 3 million. And this was of women over 15 years and older. The prevalence, the general prevalence and the couple prevalence is still the same regarding the couple of the survey in 2013. It goes between 69 to 73% of the general ones and 45 and 46% in violence that has been exerted by a couple or a former couple. And the Afro descendants or lesbian women or bisexual are the ones that have suffered more of gender-based violence throughout their life. I think I'm not going to stop here because you can see this in the presentation. These are some of the results that are quite shocking, actually. And what I want to do is to tell you what other inputs have we, or information have we obtained from this. It's something that helps us a lot with a consultation, but also it has also helped us to carry out other activities. And I think that this is part of the important thing of the surveys. In addition to get to this occult or this hidden figure, we can see what other things we can cover with these surveys here. Because of the survey, we could see the violence that girls, teenagers, and women have suffered in their own homes. This allowed us to see that 386,000 boys, girls, and teenagers live in a situation of family violence or violence in their home. Through this study of UN Women that had to do with women politician, in a study that we did between the UK Embassy and the Institute of Women here, we did a survey that included public women, politicians, actors, activists of civil society, and all those type of public type of women. And with the changes in the Twitter policies because of how to extract the information has been a little bit difficult, but I think that it's going to be quite valuable and we want that information to be updated. We also worked on something that hasn't been published yet, and I cannot share it, but that talk about the different types of violence women face and the impact that this has in how you're asking for help or not. This was done by a Uruguayan economist, and this is going to help us also to see how to tackle all the gender-based violence situations and how to work on these things without exceeding the limits, how to promote all assistance requests by these women that are undergoing or suffering this violence and see why they ask for this assistance or why they don't. And lastly, we also worked on the public policies for the assistance to boys, girls, and orphans because of a feminicide, to see everything that exists and what are the recommendations in public policy to this regard. So it's just to wrap this up, the survey is quite vast. It has a lot of information included, but I do want to say that these surveys are just like the beginning point to continue investigating this phenomena, to do this and consider other things that need to be taken care of. Not only the violence manifestations that are being present, the physical violence, and this helps us, this survey helps us to get this knowledge and this research of specific manifestations of gender-based violence. And so that's it. And thank you very much for passing me the floor. And I'm here for to answer any questions you might have. Thank you, Natalia. It's a pleasure to see how this survey has worked. I mean, it's not only just a publication, it's a live document that works more and more in the future, you know, and gives us more and more information. I know that we're going to have a lot of questions at the end of the webinar, so I would ask for you to stay here with us. Now, I'm going to ask all the audience and attendees, if you haven't done it yet, to click in the world icon for the interpretation and select the language you wish to hear this in, because our next presentations are going to be in English. It's my pleasure to introduce my next panel member. It's going to be an interesting change because we're going to set aside the sensitive registries or records area. And for that, we have Martijn Kind. He's the statistics from the UNODC, and he is our guru in data harmonization. And he's going to talk about the importance of administrative data. Martin, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Roberto. Let me just share my screen. There we go. Okay, yes, so I'll be talking on the administrative side of things. So administrative data and how we can use criminal justice statistics to combat gender-based violence. What we've seen so far has mostly focused on surveys, and surveys are, of course, a fantastic tool to investigate this phenomenon. And I just want to highlight the difference a little bit between the different measures. So we can see in the outermost sphere here, the actual prevalence of violence. Most of this is actually captured if you do a gender-based violence survey. So this is the level of disclosed violence. And then the yellow circle here represents the level of reported violence. So this is what we typically capture in administrative data. So you might wonder if it's, you know, it's a small portion of the total amount of violence. Why would we bother? Why is it important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons that I'll try to highlight in the next few slides. But one of the things that you can already see here is that there is a very small portion of the reported violence that is only captured in administrative data that is not captured by administrative data. So just to quickly highlight the difference, the top bar here is administrative data. Let's say in our case, it's data from police records. The bottom bar represents some survey data, let's say a crime victimization survey. There's a large amount of overlap, of course, between the two data sources, but like we saw, crime victimization surveys capture much more data because it captures crimes that are not reported to the police or not properly recorded by the police, or crimes that are potentially recorded as minor offenses rather than actual criminal offenses. We can also see that on the other end, there's a small portion that only administrative data captures. And this is data that is actually quite important, even though it's only a small portion, because it captures homicides, for example. Because with a survey, you typically interview people directly. And of course, you cannot interview a homicide victim. There are also other reasons why it's important. For example, for many surveys, we have a minimum age threshold. So whether it's 18 or 15, we typically don't interview children for ethical reasons. And other reasons as well. And of course, this kind of data is captured by administrative data. So it also captures offenses of children, on children. Okay, so just to quickly recap, we've seen this before in other presentations as well. Where does this administrative data come from on gender-based violence? Of course, in the presentation, I will focus on the criminal justice system. But there is also data that comes, for example, from civil justice. We can also do investigations into gender-based violence based on health statistics, for example, medical records or hospital visits. There are, of course, also other agencies involved in this, for example, housing services that help victims of domestic violence find temporary housing, for example. Using that kind of data, we can also get a better idea of the phenomenon. There are some specific indicators that are important when we're looking at gender-based violence and administrative data. This will be discussed tomorrow in the dedicated presentation on the new statistical framework on the topic that was jointly developed by UNODC and UN Women. So I won't spend any time on that here today. So just to say, in the criminal justice process, we typically recognize 4 distinct phases. Of course, how it's exactly organized per member state, but typically we go from the police, where that features as the first point of contact for a victim. They gather the evidence, then it goes to prosecution, it goes to courts, and ultimately it can go all the way to prisons. And at each stage of this process, you can collect important administrative data that can be vital in understanding gender-based violence better. So why are we interested in gathering this kind of statistics, this kind of administrative data? Well, because it allows you to capture quite detailed information, not just on the criminal actor or victim, but also on the offender. You can also get pretty detailed information on the circumstances under which the crime occurred. But we also get information from further downstream in the criminal justice system, like, are people actually prosecuted for these crimes? Do they receive sentences? What kind of sentences, etc. But we can also see how many people in the system are actually dedicated to fighting gender-based violence. Is it one small team somewhere, or are there significant dedicated resources for this? So how do we use these kinds of data? Of course, there are numerous reasons, but I'm highlighting 4 important ones here. There's, of course, an operational aspect. By better knowing where crimes happen, what is the typical profile of an offender or a victim, etc., you can fight crime a little better. There's also a managerial aspect where we can better monitor the performance of criminal justice agencies using this administrative data. For example, we can better measure the workload, staffing levels, what number of crimes are resolved, unresolved, etc. It's also important for research. By getting better data, we can formulate better evidence-based crime prevention policies. And of course, there's also an accountability aspect here, where we, by publishing more data, we can enhance public trust. I'm going to go over this very quickly because I don't have a lot of time. So just as an example, for some of the police statistics we can collect, the advantage is that it really offers a complete picture of all reported crime. Again, not all occurring crime, but all reported crime, with very detailed and reliable information on the offender and the victim. However, things are not always correctly classified, so this is an issue. And of course, this is influenced by someone's willingness to report the crime. There can, of course, be any number of reasons why people don't report crimes, or specifically gender-based violence, because they can, maybe they don't believe the police will be able to do anything, or they believe it's a personal issue that they need to resolve themselves, or maybe there's a fear of retaliation, etc. For prosecution statistics, I think one of the most important aspects we can get from this is also understanding whether reported cases are acted upon and what is the length of proceedings. Because I think, particularly for gender-based violence, it's very important to help victims in a timely way, because otherwise we might expose them to additional harm. So getting a better idea of how quickly the prosecution is acting can tell you a lot, and also point to areas that you need to improve. I can say the same for court statistics, but I think I'll just move ahead. So what are some of the advantages of these administrative data compared to survey data in particular? Is that they're typically much cheaper to collect because surveys are quite expensive to run. The data is also of higher frequency, and it's usually more timely because surveys take a long time to plan and execute, etc. Whereas administrative data can be collected in real time if done well, and it's also highly detailed data. Of course, there are also some challenges associated with administrative data. The most important one being that there's often an incoherent use of statistical concepts and definitions between different institutions. So data is not comparable, but it can also be more basic issues, like even just ensuring that data is exchanged between different institutions. So it can be challenging at times. Then I just want to show you some very brief examples from the regions. I'll skip over these. So this is one that I wanted to show. This is something that I found on the website of the National Police of Colombia, where we have domestic violence offenses, actually at a very high frequency. So we can see the number of offenses reported on every single day, and we keep seeing small little spikes. These happen every time there's a weekend. And just to say that this is data as of the 6th of January of this year. So this is why it tapers out at the end of December. It's not like everybody just suddenly became very peaceful around New Year. It's just those data were not available at the time of release. And I also just quickly want to show this example for Mexico, where we have the domestic violence incidents recorded in calls from the 911 system. And here I plotted it on a map as a rate per 100,000 people. Our colleagues will actually talk about this more tomorrow, about 911 data and innovative ways of using this data, but I just wanted to give you an idea here. You can see that some states have much higher levels, whether this is because there's a higher occurrence of gender-based violence or because of classification issues, that's a different matter. And then I just quickly want to highlight some of the work that we've been doing for standardizing administrative data. We're currently working on producing some guidelines that offer a basic international framework for collecting all sorts of data that go far beyond just offense data. There will be 3 guidelines for specific institutions. So one for the police that has already been released, one for prosecution and courts, and one for prisons. And then we also hope to develop a 4th guideline that will go into more depth on how to actually build a functioning criminal justice statistical system where data freely flows between the institutions and it can inform policymaking. Just so that everybody has seen this, the police guidelines have been released and they are available now in case you're interested. Also, please feel free to contact me or ask me questions if you want to know more about this. And that was exactly 10 minutes. So, Roberto, that was it.
Thank you so much, Martijn. Perfectly timed. Un aviso para todos nuestros asistentes. Los lineamientos.
To let our attendees know, the guidelines that Martijn showed are currently only in English, but we are working the version in Spanish with all of you. So all of those attendees to this webinar, once we have the Spanish version, we're going to send it to them so that you can consult it. Sometimes it's easier to have it in your own language, and especially for the Caribbean, you can have them available right now because they're in English and you can start using them. Thank you, Martijn. And so now we're going to go to our next presentation. This is our last presentation of the day, but it's quite relevant and it connects to everything that we saw in the other presentations, because we're going to see how from the Caribbean community, they are promoting the recollection of administrative data specifically for those cases related to domestic violence. And it's a pleasure to introduce, and I thank Sherwin Toyne-Stephenson for the time provided. He's the manager of the Human Social Development Program for CARICOM. And so thank you very much for this time. And Sherwin, you have the floor then. And so
the 15-minute time frame, and I'll let you know when we have 5 minutes left.
It's a pleasure to be invited, and we, of course, we're glad to share on what we're doing. So could I have the first slide, or would you like me to share from this end?
Whichever you prefer, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah.
I
prefer that you all run it. Okay, great.
Yes.
So, so my presentation today is really going to look at, if you could have the next slide. Right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definitions that we use, because it's important for us to define how we describe domestic violence, some of the advantages that we found in using administrative data, what are some of the benefits to our region, and of course, I'm going to introduce you to the CARICOM data collection protocols. I won't go into all of it, but I will just highlight some of the areas for persons to begin to understand the direction in which we're going. Could I have the next slide? So the World Health Organization, in their World Report on Violence and Health, offer the following definition of violence, not the one you see on the screen. They say that the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. The regional protocol itself, however, uses an amended version that focuses on the adult incidents of domestic violence, which you see up here. Domestic violence, for the purpose of the protocol, will be restricted to acts of violence, whether physical, verbal, or other abuse on a romantic, sexual, or intimate partner, whether presently or formerly a member of the household, or whether as a party to a visiting or dating relationship. Next slide. So what we consider to be administrative data is data that is collected for the administration of programs. It should be systematically collected, stored, and used for program operation and management decisions. And of course, while administrative data is designed to track a program's implementation, primarily project activities and expenses, it can also include indicators on program outcomes. And some of the examples for administrative data that we use include educational records, client information from financial institutions, and hospital records of patient visits and health outcomes. And of course, other examples include information held by other government agencies, such as tax filings and insurance claims. The next slide. So we found that the use of administrator has greatly benefited the region and continues to benefit. And right now it's being used primarily at the national level, and we're going to be ramping up that so that we have a systematic flow of that information being collected at the regional level for us to begin to make analysis at this level. So administrative data for us are especially useful in organizations since they often offer a cost-effective means of collecting large amounts of data, which is unlike some other data collection initiatives like victimization surveys. We found that administrative data are typically collected on entire population beneficiaries of a service. And not only are data also collected through institutions like state agencies and health facilities, they are also regularly updated, which is important for us. And they are typically very accurate when we consider comparing them to self-reported data. And for these reasons, efforts to strengthen collection were crucial to CARICOM to be able to fully understand the phenomenon of domestic violence. An important function of administrative data for us that cannot be underestimated is its ability to be used in monitoring and evaluation. Administrative data collection tools that are designed to collect information on follow-up actions to be taken by the client and institution, for instance, can be used to evaluate the performance of the institutional response in tandem with evaluations and the impact of the evaluation. Next slide. There are, of course, okay, so I went a bit ahead, but before we get to this limitations, there are some limitations. The limited scope reduces the ability to make advanced population comparisons, but of course, that's where we'd be linking back into prevalence survey data to get that kind of information. All right. So the manual itself is divided into 6 sections. Our first section is describes institutional details. Section 2 gives the report details. Section 3 provides some incident details. Section 4, the victim characteristics. Section 5, perpetrator characteristics. And Section 6, remedial action. Next slide. I will go into some of these, not all of it because time does not permit, so the slides would actually capture examples of the kind of information that we are using here. So for institutional details, of course, we focus on the name of the organization receiving the report, any specific codes used to identify the specific unit receiving the report, where the organization itself is located, the date of the intake of the information and the time, the interviewer's name, which is critically important, and the interviewer's position and or institutional ID if it's applicable. Next slide. For our section 2, which looks at reports, this section can be completed by any informant, whether they are the victim, perpetrator, or other informants. Information on previous reports may not be known by the informant, and in this instance, we advise the persons who are taking the data to select not known where applicable or enter not known in available fields. Some of the data collected would be the client status. We need to identify whether persons completing the report is the victim, perpetrator, or chooses to remain anonymous. And also to be able to identify the relationship between the informant and the victim. If anonymous, inquire whether they are willing to provide this information. Of course, if this report is being made on behalf of a minor or dependent, it's important to note whether this is being completed on behalf of a minor or another dependent. Of course, that would include persons with severe mental disabilities. Data that is also captured in this field includes the informant's name if anonymous, an identification PIN, which is all information that have been provided by the informant. We look at the informant's sex. If anonymous, of course, we select not stated. And of course, we also point out to the persons collecting the information to note that sex describes the biological traits that make us male, female, or intersex. And we ask the interviewers to note that gender identity refers to how a person identifies their own gender, and inquire about how that's to ensure that the informant does not avoid making assumptions. Also under this section, we look at the types of institution, the names. Has an arrest been made, to be able to identify whether or not an arrest has been made for this incident, to also identify the date on which the prosecution decision, if there was one, was made, and to provide further details of any decision that was made, including the date and the specific terms of any sentence therein. Next slide. Section 3 describes the incident details. Where this section is being completed by an informant, efforts are made to acquire as much information about the incident as possible. Where information cannot be provided, of course, this is indicated on the form. And for details not captured, we also have a training for persons to really look again at how and build capacity in terms of how they form the incident narrative. One of the areas we look at is the ordinal status of the incident. We identify whether the incident was the first incident, that is, if no other incidents or violence have occurred. First reported incidents, that is, previous incidents have occurred, but none in fact were reported. Or a repeat incident, that is where both have been, one or more incidents and one or more reports have been made. We're also able to identify whether or not the person being respondent to this incident is the same one that has been identified in previous reports. This field also captures the injury status, which indicates whether or not injuries occurred as a result of the incident. And of course, if there were any other injuries, whether or not a report has been made. The informant and the victim, the same person, that needs to be clearly discerned, and providing these details are sometimes, we recognize sometimes are challenging and psychologically triggering. We recognize also that this is a traumatic experience and that they may not be comfortable with stating that injuries have occurred for a number of reasons. Of course, they may be afraid that the respondent retaliates with worse acts of violence. A victim may also wear clothing, hold themselves in positions, or use objects to hide the injuries sustained. And of course, we train our persons that are taking the information to be aware of this and to make note of whether or not they observe any of these behaviors and to determine whether or not further prompts may be necessary to accurately complete this section. And of course, the mode of injury is something that we also look very carefully at. Similar to the previous section, these details may be difficult for an informant who is the victim to answer. Okay, could I have the next slide?
Please, Sherwin, 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
10 minutes? Got 5 minutes left? Okay, good. I'm doing well then. We look at the victim characteristics, and of course, if this information is being taken by an informant who is not the victim, the fields are critical for them to complete. Any missing information we recognize could be acquired from a separate report following up with the victim. If follow-up action is to be taken and where the informant cannot provide further details, we make allowances for not known or data not known in the prescribed fields. What is also important, we also note whether or not the client lives with any disabilities. Asking about disabilities also requires sensitivity. Could I have the next slide? Perpetrator characteristics, similar to the victim characteristics, we take the same kind of precautions. And of course, these fields reflect that information. Next slide. And of course, remedial action. We also find out whether or not, if there's an emergency, does the client require any kind of remedial action? Next slide. So this has been quite an undertaking to get this information out to our member states. But of course, we have a lot of expectations coming out of it. We hope to be able to harmonize our regional efforts, standardize the way we do assessments, and reverse trends of underreporting, which really stymies creating any kind of interventions that we would determine or build to be able to treat with domestic violence. Next slide, which is basically me saying thank you for listening to me for that time. I hope I've stuck within my time period. And of course, any questions would be follow the normal roads. Thank you so much for having me.
No, on the contrary, you were perfect on the timing. We actually have some minutes left. Thank you very much. And it was really amazing to see the work that you have done. I know that it seems like an easy endeavor, but I know, and we know perfectly well that you have been working on this, or you worked in this for years to have this protocol manual. So we're really, really glad to see also the benefits and the possible outcomes that have been foreseen out of this effort. Muchísimas
We want to thank all our panel members. We're really happy to see that we have a lot of participation by all the attendees. We have a lot of questions. We've seen questions in the Q&A section and questions presented in the chat itself. So we thank you for your participation. Because of time constraints, we're going to do just one round of questions. I just apologize. We're going to be able to check all the questions, answer all the questions. But I can assure we're taking note of all the questions and we're going to try to answer them afterwards, especially if they're directed to one of the panel members specifically. But in the same order that we had the presentations, I'm going to ask a question for Andrea. And I've seen that there are many questions, and so I'm going to try to couple several of them. Some of them talk about the age ranges for all of these violence surveys. In this case, we've seen several questions that have to do with the identification of violence in girls and teenagers. And there's also a lot of questions on the recommendations that you have of the age groups. And that because in the comparison that you showed, we saw that there are different trends in the region. So I think that this is something that has a lot of interest. I don't know if you have any comments to this regards. And thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I think that these always help us with the analysis and the reflection. Now, regarding the guidelines of the UN document, we really mention that the recommendation is 15 years of age or older. When we talk to some of the countries, what they were saying is that when they were underage, the law stipulates that they had to receive an authorization from one of the parents so that they could be part of the survey. However, the recommendation or the guidelines is 15 years or more, but it all depends on the context and the analysis in the country to be able to define all of these age topics. In the previous year, I also wanted to mention, we also had a space to talk about what happened with elderly women also. So there are other challenges present there that need to be considered. For example, how to define the instrument, the question, what ages, and what additional questions would be important and should be added if we add other age groups. And something that was also mentioned, Roberto, that has to do with the age group is the intersectionality. You know, even though in the surveys it's important to do this, we want to have a more in-depth analysis of the population, not only in the territory, which is what we saw that they do this in many of the countries, how they're divided in the territory. This is a challenge that specifically analyzes what is happening in the samples and how they design the samples. So we should always have to pay attention to whenever we are estimating certain subgroups that are not fully considered, what are going to be the coefficients of the evaluation so that we can have solid results and so that these results can help us for public policy decisions. I don't know if you want me to continue talking about this or just go more in depth in an additional topic. No, thank you very much. I think that right now it's just like a teaser. I mean, if we can have a second round of questions, we can go back to you. Now I would like to ask something to Mariana, because Mariana asked to answer this question live. And this has a lot to do with what you were mentioning, Andrea, about the intersectionality. There's a question that talks about the different elements or aspects of the intersectionality that has to do with the rural area, with ethnicity, with the age of the person that is being interviewed, even literacy aspects. And they're asking us to tell them how they can cover all of these elements, especially when we have indigenous languages or other dialects, and when we want to cover women that maybe are illiterate. Mariana, I see that you're interested in answering this, so I would like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the question. I'm just giving a second so we can switch to English. So that was a very interesting question, and what I can share is our experience on the SDG16 survey. The first thing is that we'll not be able to accommodate to all the variations, all the types of population groups, but there's two different actions. One is we try to have all the different population groups involved in the initial phase of design of the survey to adapt in the specific country. So involving all stakeholders guarantee that we don't have questions that are too far from what is desired. I can give you an example. For instance, for one of the countries that we had, the physical harassment questions were found not fully adequate. So there was an alert from the civil society organization for stakeholders involved. So these are the type of consideration that we can take into account. In some cases, what we'll need to do is have more questions specifically. This is not directly related with this model, but with other models. You might have to do other questions that are very specific for this group, taking into account that the more granular you want the data, the bigger your sample has to be, also the higher the cost will have to be. The survey, SDG16 survey, recommends all the minimum aggregation, which is several factors, but at the end, it has to be the national considerations at the time of implementing. And for this question, I also like to invite my UNODC colleagues to add, since it's their model.
Muchas gracias, Mariana. Justamente enseguida pasaremos a darle la palabra también.
Yes, and I will now pass the floor to Martin to answer this one. But there are a lot of questions regarding the survey in Uruguay. And since we are almost done, I just want Natalia to very briefly answer this. There are several questions that have to do with the measurements that were done through the survey. There's two specifically that I think that are quite important. One has to do with digital violence. I think that is quite important to see how they are tackling digital violence and what were the types of violence that were identified. And can we connect this with the use for this type of information or the use that was planned to for this type of information? So Natalia, just do it as brief as possible, please. Thank you. I think that I already answered one via the chat. And the reality is that in Uruguay, we don't have a specific guideline on digital violence per se, but we do have the crime of disclosing or showing private or intimate images of a person without their consent. That's the base of everything. So what we did is we worked together with Twitter. Twitter told us that there were like 3,000 public women, and we started classifying this digital violence with them. And we developed 5 or 6 different categories of digital violence that could be improved. But we actually understand that in several of the notifications, they see that they are saying that they don't have the capabilities, the physical or emotional capabilities. They attack them for their political views. They also talk about their body, their identity, or their sexuality. All type of humiliating expressions are being included. And we had 6 rounds of training with 6 different trainers based on the algorithm that we worked together with the UNDP. So we did a lot of work here to include this digital arena. Thank you very much. I see many questions regarding the specific topic of feminicide. And just as an ad, I would like you to invite all of you tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to specifically talk about feminicide. What is the methodology that we promote from the United Nations, and what are some examples of some countries that are measuring those? So we're going to leave those questions to answer them tomorrow. But I do want to ask a question that is really related to Martin's and Sherwin's presentations, and I'm going to go into English.
Some questions regarding the challenges that you face when collecting administrative data. And if I think that Martijn, maybe you can walk us through some general challenges, but I think that Sherwin, from the perspective that you have shown us from domestic violence, what were the main challenges that you faced or that you see that countries are facing in terms of collecting this type of information or of implementing the guidelines? Both Martijn and Sherwin, you have shared some very interesting guidelines. I'd like to see if you have seen any challenges or foreseen any challenges in terms of their implementation. I don't know if Martijn, yeah, I see your camera on, so please go first, and then we'll go to Sherwin.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, the guidelines are fairly new, so we still have to implement them. So I can also only speak about it in a more generic way. But typically, what we've seen in other countries also with other standards, for example, the implementation of the international classification of crime for statistical purposes, it's always a challenge to get all the actors in the criminal justice sector to work together, even though they're all in the same sector. It can be very challenging to get the police, prosecution courts to all exchange data and also provide data, for example, to the National Statistical Office. So one of the things that we're finding so far that typically the challenge is, of course, partially it's a technical challenge, but more than that, it's typically a political challenge, getting that political support and getting all the actors on the same page. That seems to be the more significant challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Sherwin, I don't know if you'd have anything to add,
Sure.
something to show
yes,
panelists.
For us, certainly, because we're 15 plus member states, the biggest challenge really, and this is some of the things that we were trying to address when we developed the protocol manual, was the fact that for each one of those member states, the Domestic Violence Act had different definitions. So I think it's a problem that Martin, I think, alluded to a little bit in terms of what we know, how does the ICCS describe the particular act? So we had to define domestic violence, as you saw me did, which was critical, and then build all the outcomes around that. So certainly the issues of harmonization, issues of legislation, and even to collect, in some instances, the information. There has to be changes at the national and community levels for our member states. And of course, communication is another issue that provides a challenge in terms, and this is simply in terms of what system do we use for member states to report up to the regional headquarters. Of course, we know we've provided the manual for each one of them, but we're working on now, post a symposium that we had in April that looked at treating specifically with violence. We're going to be building up some more prescriptions and gathering that data at the regional level so that we could inform policy, or at least try to create a model legislation for those institutions or governments that require it, so that we can all be harmonized and moving together. So those were our main challenges in moving forward. Of course, in terms of the psychological, persons who are reporting domestic violence don't often do it. They have to be encouraged, which is why we were focusing on administrative data, because we could get a lot of that information as well from the health institutions and other institutions that persons feel safe going to. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I think the conceptual aspects that you have mentioned and the reporting aspects as well are key to bear in mind when we are trying to collect this data. Thank you all. Muchas gracias a todos, de verdad, por su participación, por habernos acompañado.
Thank you all for your participation and for joining us. I'd like for all of you to turn your cameras on, to thank all the audience that was with us. So just turn your cameras on to thank them. We have a final message. We have a lot of comments where they're asking for further information, access to the presentation, access to the documents that were referred to. And I'm also seeing that there are some requests for support or assistance and to see how to contact all of you. And I would like to let the attendees know that we will send you the contact information, and we're going to send an email with all of these presentations so that we can share all the materials with all of you. And they're all also going to be on the Excellence Center website. So we'll have that information. We'll see each other tomorrow at the same time with the same link. And we're going to talk tomorrow about feminicide and the use of emergency call centers. I think this is going to be a fascinating topic for all the attendees. Andrea, Mariana, Natalia, Martin, Sherwin, thank you. And see you next time. Have a great day.
Same to you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.